Today we're going to be talking about the Ulfhednar, the wolf warriors of Norse culture. I've always been fascinated by the use of wolves in Viking culture, enough so that I have a tattoo of Fenrir on my left arm. First, we'll read from an article called Berserkers and Other Shamanic Warriors that I found on the Norse mythology website. The shamanism of the pre-Christian Norse and other Germanic peoples took several different forms. Among the most common of these forms, especially for men, was the attainment and use of an ecstatic battle fury, closely linked to a particular totem animal, usually a bear or a wolf, and often occurring within the context of certain formal military groups. During the Viking Age, these warrior shamans typically fell into two groups, the Berserkers and the Ulfhednar. These groups were a late development of the earlier Germanic warband and shared much in common with the warlike shamanism of other circumpolar peoples. As far as we can tell today, the Berserkers and Ulfhednar shared a common set of shamanic practices, with the only substantial difference being that the totem animal of the Berserkers was, as the name implies, the bear, while that of the Ulfhednar was the wolf. These names are a reference to the practice of dressing in a ritual costume made from the hide of the totem animal, an outward reminder of the wearer's having gone beyond the confines of his humanity and become a divine predator. It's hard to imagine a grislier or more frightening thing to encounter on the late Iron Age battlefield. One of the defining features of shamanic traditions across the world is an initiation process characterized by symbolic and occasional literal death and rebirth, whereby the shaman-to-be acquires his or her powers. Candidates for Germanic shamanic military societies underwent such a process before being admitted into the group. They spent a period in the wilderness, living like their totem animal and learning its ways, obtaining their sustenance through hunting, gathering, and raiding the nearest towns. To quote the esteemed archaeologist Dominique Briquel, Rapto vivir, to live in the manner of the wolves, is the beginning of this initiation. The bond with the savage world is indicated not only on the geographic plane, life beyond the limits of the civilized life of the towns, but also on what we would consider a moral plane. Their existence is assured by the law of the jungle. The candidate ceased to be an ordinary human being and became instead a wolf man or a bear man, more a part of the forest than of civilization. Thenceforth, he had the ability to induce a state of possession by his kindred beast, acquiring its strength, fearlessness, and fury. We have only the haziest idea of the techniques used to reach this ecstatic trance state, but we know that fasting, exposure to extreme heat, and ceremonial weapon dances were among the shamanic toolkit of the ancient Germanic peoples. It's extremely likely that the warrior shamans used these techniques along numerous others that have been lost in the centuries of malign neglect that have passed since these were living traditions. Quick side note on that, I've also heard that the use of psychedelic herbs or plants of some sort mixed in mead was used with the Berserkers and Ulfhednar before marching into battle. Alright, continuing. On the battlefield, the Berserker, or Ulfhednar, would enter the fray naked but for his animal mask and pelts, howling, roaring, and running amok with the godly or demonic courage. As the Ynglinga saga puts it, Odin's men, Berserkers and Ulfhednar, went armorless into battle and were as crazed as dogs or wolves, and as strong as bears or bulls. They bit their shields and slew men while they themselves were harmed neither by fire nor iron. This is called going berserk. In the biting or casting away of their shields, we see a reminder that their ultimate identity is no longer their social persona, but rather their unity with the animal world that they have achieved through self-dehumanization. A warrior's shield and weapons were the very emblems of his social persona and status. They were given to a young man who had come of age by his father, a closest male relative, to mark his newfound arrival into the sphere of the rights and responsibilities of his society's adult men. In the biting or discarding of the shield, the mythical beast triumphed over the petty man, and Odin's men tore through the battle, psychologically impervious to pain by virtue of their predatory stance. Like other northern Eurasian shamans, Germanic warrior shamans are occasionally depicted with spirit wives, in this case from among the Valkyries, the female attendant spirits of Odin. Fair warning, I am probably going to butcher a couple of names in this last section here, but here we go. In the polytheistic system of the pre-Christian Germanic peoples, wherein different sorts of people venerated different sorts of deities, the Berserkers, Ulfhednar, and other warrior shamans were exemplary devotees of Odin, the Allfather of northern gods and the giver of odor, ecstasy, fury, inspiration. Odor is the source of poetic inspiration and philosophical insight as well as battle frenzy. Thus, it should come as no surprise that many of Odin's men, such as Egil, Skallgrimsson, and Stakkerir, were also warrior poets. They were no ordinary soldiers. Their battle frenzy, with all of its grotesqueness and violence, was of a rarefied, even poetic sort, and being a gift from Odin, it was inherently sacred. Next, I'm going to read a little bit from an article called The Long Hidden History of the Viking Obsession with Werewolves, written by Sarah Dern. After a hard day's work of thieving, Sigmundur and his son Sinfjotli happened upon a house. It looked empty as they slipped inside to find two wealthy men fast asleep. Hanging above them were two luxurious wolf skins. The father and son helped themselves. They were thieves, after all. But when they put the pelts on, they started to walk on all fours and grow long, fang-like teeth. They howled at the night sky and bared their teeth. Out in the forest, they confronted several bands of men and left none standing, more than 13 victims between them. With no one left to stalk, Sigmundur attacked Sinfjotli, digging his long teeth into his son's neck. When he realized what he'd done, he used a magical herb to restore Sinfjotli's health. 11 days after their transformation, father and son returned to their human form and burned the nefarious pelts. The story of Sigmundur and Sinfjotli is one of the Viking world's oldest and most popular tales, passed down orally for centuries before being written down in the Sogna saga around 1270. It turns out the Vikings were a bit obsessed with wolves and the people who became them. There are upwards of 50 different werewolf stories Vikings would tell around roaring fires to help pass long, dark Scandinavian winters. Wolves, such as the world-ending Fenrir, are woven into their mythology. Viking warrior bands would growl and howl and bite in battle, and sometimes even attack their compatriots in their frenzy. It's something victims of Viking raids also saw in the Norsemen who descended on them from the seas. They refer to them as sea wolves and werewolves in medieval histories. Even after the raids stopped, popular stories linked Viking descendants to werewolves. The Viking obsession with wolves extends to the artifacts they left behind, such as the elaborately carved animal head post found in the Osberg burial, part of the recently announced new museum of the Viking Age in Oslo. Viking werewolf stories, like Sigmundur and Sinfjotli's, reflect the complexity of the wolf as a symbol in Viking society. Vikings both admired wolf's strength, and as a largely agricultural society, feared it. Wolves prowl on the edges. They're destroyers, kind of night creatures, and they're strongest in some ways where we are weakest, says historian Lars Brownsworth, author of The Sea Wolves, A History of the Vikings. And yet, Vikings, especially particular tribes, embrace a connection to wolves, says Dutch historical anthropologist William de Blikhoort. The Odin-worshipping warrior bands known as Ulfhednar would, according to Viking sagas, bite their shields, make blood-curdling howls, fight with their fingernails, and seem to experience no pain in battle. Instead of traditional armor, Ulfhednar are said to have worn wolf skins. There may have been some sort of shamanistic or magical ritual that Ulfhednar would undergo before battle to connect spiritually with the spirit of the wild animal, says one Old Norse literature expert from the University of Iceland. For young Viking warriors, this might have been a necessary delusion. It's much easier to go into war imagining yourself to be a wild animal, she says, than the teenager that you are. Like their wolf counterparts, Ulfhednar were both feared and respected. Brownsworth references Harald Hardrada's saga, in which the fearsome warriors start attacking his own men because they're completely senseless, and yet the battle-frenzied Ulfhednar are also considered elite warriors. Norway's first king, Harald Fairhair, kept a band of them as his bodyguard. The 8th century poet Horncloths, Ravensong lauds that unit. Wolf coats, they call them that in battle. Bellow into bloody shields. They wear wolf's hides when they come into the fight, and clash their weapons together. After all, the Ulfhednar were followers of Odin, the god of both madness and wisdom, says Brownsworth, and like Odin, they are complex, even contradictory figures. The Viking werewolf stories recorded in the sagas are, in many ways, a literary legacy of the Ulfhednar. All the earliest werewolf stories are connected to war. In an article entitled The Werewolf in Medieval Icelandic Literature, it states, in the case of Sigmundur and Sinfjotli, Sigmundur takes his son into the woods, since to become a fully trained warrior, Sinfjotli must come to know his animal nature, the wild animal within him. But as Brownsworth notes, that's not entirely a good thing. When they become wolves, they start off like, oh, this is neat, but they quickly lose themselves and go on this killing spree. Even after Sigmundur and Sinfjotli return to their human bodies, their family's association with wolves continues. Sinfjotli is called Ylfingr, a wolfling. Sigurður, another son of Sigmundur, when asked his name, says, I am called the noble beast. Of 46 Icelandic sagas, 14 of them have werewolves prowling about, and there are even more stalking the Norwegian sagas. Alright, I might get a couple names wrong again, but bear with me. For the Europeans on the receiving end of Viking raids, equating their attackers with wolves and werewolves didn't come with the same complexity. The metaphor only served to paint the Vikings as terrible, almost inhuman warriors. In the 11th century, Norman monk William of Jumlages compared Vikings to agile wolves set out to rip apart the Lord's sheep. In an anonymous Old English poem recounting the 991 Battle of Maldon, the Vikings were described as the wolves of slaughter. When recounting the raid at Lindisfarne, the English chronicler Simeon of Durham writes that the Vikings, like fearful wolves, robbed, tore, and slaughtered not only beasts of burden, sheep and oxen, but even priests and deacons and companies of monks and nuns. Wolves were brutal. Vikings were brutal. For Europeans, the metaphor didn't carry much meaning beyond that, at least for several centuries. Alright, that's all I'm going to get into for today. I hope you enjoyed listening. And for those of you that did enjoy, please let me know in the comments. Like this video, subscribe. You know the whole works. Thank you for watching.